The complete works of Swami Vivekananda, Practical Vedanta, the Ideal of a Universal Religion, Part 3. The first test of true teaching must be that the teaching should not contradict reason. And you may see that such is the basis of all these yogas. We take Raj Yoga, the psychological yoga, the psychological way to union. It is a vast subject, and I can only point out to you that the central idea of this yoga. We have but one method of acquiring knowledge. From the lowest man to the highest yogi, all have to use the same method. And that method is what is called concentration. The chemist who works in his laboratory concentrates all the powers of his mind, brings them into one focus, and throws them on the elements, and the elements stand analyzed, and thus his knowledge comes. The astronomer has also concentrated the powers of his mind and brought them into one focus, and he throws them onto the objects through his telescope, and stars and systems roll forward and give up their secrets to him. So it is with every case, with the professor in his chair, the student with his book, with every man who is working to know. You are hearing me, and if my words interest you, your mind will become concentrated on them. And then, suppose a clock strikes, you will not hear it on account of this concentration. And the more you are able to concentrate your mind, the better you will be able to understand me. And the more I concentrate my love and powers, the better I shall be able to give expression to what I want to convey to you. The more this power of concentration, the more knowledge is acquired, because this is the one and only method of acquiring knowledge. Even the lowest shoe block, if he gives more concentration, will black shoes better. The cook with concentration will cook a meal all the better. In making money or in worshipping God or in doing anything, the stronger the power of the concentration, the better will be the thing done. This is the one call, the one knock which opens the gates of nature and lets out the floods of light. This, the power of concentration, is the only key to the treasure house of knowledge. The system of Raj Yoga deals almost exclusively with this. In the present state of our body, we are so much distracted, and the mind is frittering away its energies upon 100 sorts of things. As soon as I try to calm my thoughts and concentrate my mind upon any one object of knowledge, thousands of undesired impulses rush into the brain, thousands of thoughts rush into the mind and disturb it. How to check it and bring the mind under control is the whole study in Raj Yoga. Now take Karam Yoga, the attainment of God through work. It is evident that in society there are many persons who seem to be born for some sort of activity or the other, whose minds cannot be concentrated on the plane of thought alone, and who have but one idea concretized in work, visible and tangible. There must be a science for this kind of life too. Each one of us is engaged in some work, but the majority of us fritter away the greater portion of our energies, because we do not know the secret of work. Karam Yoga explains the secret and teaches where and how to work, how to employ the greatest advantage and the largest part of our energies in the work that is before us. But with this secret, we must take into consideration the great objection against work, namely that it causes pain. All misery and pain come from attachment. I want to do work. I want to do good to a human being. And it is 90 to 1 that that human being whom I have helped will prove ungrateful and go against me, and the result to me is pain. Such things deter mankind from working, and it spoils a good portion of the work and energy of mankind. This fear of pain and misery, Karma Yoga teaches us how to work for work's sake, unattached, without caring who is helping and what for. The Karma Yogi feels because it is his nature, because he feels that it is good for him to do so. And he has no object beyond that. His position in this world is that of a giver, and he never cares to receive anything. He knows that he is giving and does not ask for anything in return, and therefore he eludes the grasp of misery, the grasp of pain, and whenever it comes is the result of the reaction of attachment. Then there is the Bhakti Yoga for the man of emotional nature, the lover. He wants to love God, he relies upon and uses all sorts of rituals, flowers, incense, beautiful things, forms, and also all such things. Do you mean to say that they are wrong? One fact I must tell you, it is good for you to remember, in this country especially, that the world's great spiritual giants have all been produced only by these religious sects, which have been in possession of very rich mythology and ritual. All sects that have attempted to worship God without any form or ceremony have crushed without mercy everything that is beautiful and sublime in religion. Their religion is a fanaticism at best, a dry thing. The history of the world is a standing witness to this fact. Therefore, do not decry these rituals and mythologies. Let people have them. Let those who so desire have them. Do not exhibit that unworthy derisive smile and say, they are fools. Let them have it. Not so. The greatest man I have seen in my life, the most wonderfully developed in spirituality, have all come through the discipline of these rituals. I do not hold myself worthy to sit at their feet and for me to criticize them. How do I know how these ideas act upon the human minds? Which of them I am to accept and which to reject? We are apt to criticize everything in the world without sufficient warrant. Let people have all the mythology they want, with its beautiful inspirations, for you must bear in mind that emotional natures do not care for abstract definitions of the truth. God to them is something tangible, the only thing that is real. They feel, hear, and see Him and love Him. Let them have their God. Your rationalist seems to them to be like the fool who, when he saw a beautiful statue, wanted to break it to find out of what material it was made. Bhakti Yoga teaches them how to love without any ulterior motives, loving God and loving the good because it is good to do so, not for going to heaven, not to get children, wealth, or anything else. It teaches them that love itself is the highest recompense of love, that God Himself is love. It teaches them to pay all kinds of tribute to God as the Creator, the Omnipresent, the Omniscient, Almighty Ruler, Father and Mother. The highest praise that can express Him, the highest idea that the human mind can conceive of Him, is that He is the God of love. Wherever there is love, it is He. Wherever there is any love, it is He. The Lord is present there. Where the husband kisses the wife, He is there in the kiss. Where the mother kisses the child, He is there in the kiss. Where friends clasp hands, He, the Lord, is present as the God of love. When a great man loves and wishes to help mankind, He is there giving freely His bounty of love to mankind. Wherever the heart expands, He is there manifested. This is what Bhakti Yoga teaches. We lastly come to the Jnana Yogi, the philosopher, the thinker, who wants to go beyond the visible. He is the man who is not satisfied with the little things of this world. His idea is to go beyond the daily routine of eating, drinking, and so on. And not even the teaching of thousands of books will satisfy him. Not even all the sciences will satisfy him. At best, they will only bring him this little world of satisfaction. Not even myriads of stream of worlds will satisfy him. They are to him but a drop in the ocean of existence. His soul wants to go beyond all that is the very heart of being, by seeing reality as it is, by realizing it, by being it, by becoming one with that universal being. That is the philosopher. To say that God is the father or the mother, the creator of this universe, its protector and guide, is to him quite inadequate to express him. To him, God is the life of his life, the soul of his soul. God is his own self. Nothing else remains which is other than God. All the mortal parts of him become bounded by the weighty strokes of philosophy and are brushed away. What at last truly remains is God himself. Upon the same tree, there are two birds, one on top, the other below. The one on top is calm, silent, and majestic, immersed in his own glory. The one on the lower branches eats sweet and bitter fruits by turns. Hopping from one branch to another, is becoming happy and miserable by turns. After a time, the lower bird eats an exceptionally bitter fruit and gets disgustful and looks up and sees the other bird, that wondrous one of golden plumage, who neither eats sweet nor bitter fruit, who is neither happy nor miserable, but calm, self-centered, and sees nothing beyond himself. The lower bird longs for this condition but soon forgets it and again begins to eat the fruits. In a little while he eats another exceptionally bitter fruit, which makes him feel miserable, and he again looks up and tries to get nearer to the upper bird. Once more he forgets, and after a time he looks up, and so on he goes on and on again until he comes very near to the beautiful bird and sees the reflection of light from his plumage playing around his own body, and he feels a change and seems to melt away. Still nearer he comes, and everything about him melts away, and at last he understands this wonderful change. The lower bird, as it were, only the substantial looking shadow, the reflection of the higher. He himself was in essence the upper bird all the time. This eating of fruits, sweet and bitter, this lower little bird weeping and happy by turns, was a vain chimera, a dream. All along the real bird was there above, calm and silent, glorious and majestic, beyond grief and beyond sorrow. The upper bird is God, the Lord of this universe, and the lower bird is the human soul, eating the sweet and bitter fruits of this world. Now and then comes a heavy blow to the soul. For a time he stops the eating and goes toward the unknown God. And a flood of light comes. He thinks that this world is a vain show. Yet again the senses drag him down, and he begins to before him, as earlier, to eat the sweet and bitter fruits of the world. Again an exceptionally hard blow comes. His heart becomes open again to divine light, and thus gradually he approaches God. And as he gets nearer and nearer, he finds his old self melting away. When he has come near enough, he sees that he is no other than God. And he explains, he whom I have described to you as life of this universe, as present in the atoms and in suns and moons, he is the basis of our own life, the soul of our souls. Nay, thou art that. This is what this Jnana Yoga teaches. It tells man that he is essentially divine. It shows to mankind the real unity of being, and that each one of us is the Lord God Himself manifested on earth. All of us, from the lowest worm that crawls under our feet to the highest beings to whom we look up with wonder and awe, all are manifestations of the same Lord. Lastly, it is imperative that all these various yogas should be carried out in practice. Mere theories about them will not do any good. First, we have to hear about them. Then, we have to think about them. We have to reason the thoughts out, impress them on our minds. We have to meditate on them, realize them until at last they become our whole life. No longer will religion remain a bundle of ideas or theories, nor an intellectual assent. It will enter into our very self. By means of intellectual assent, we may today subscribe to many foolish things and change our minds altogether tomorrow. But true religion never changes. Religion is realization, not talk, not doctrine, not theories. However beautiful they may be, it is being and becoming, not hearing or acknowledging. It is the whole soul becoming changed into what it believes. That is religion.